25 years ago, it was a period marked by immense setbacks for the international communist movement and for struggles of national and social liberation. 25 years ago, the world was faced with a difficult conjuncture. We witnessed the sole dominance of US imperialism after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the retreat of socialism in China. Under the banner of neoliberal globalization, imperialist exploitation and plunder spread with little restraint, deepening poverty, dispossession, war, and inequality across the globe was witnessed and felt especially by the global majority. Yet, it was precisely in this moment of retreat and fragmentation that the International League of People's Struggle took up an urgent historic task to unite the mass movements across and sectors in resistance against imperialism and all forms of reaction. ILPS became a space for solidarity, political clarity, and coordinated struggle, helping sustain the fires of resistance when conditions were especially adverse. Today, however, the conditions of imperialism are no longer the same. US imperialism remains aggressive, but is no longer unchallenged. We are witnessing decline as it struggles to maintain unipolar dominance in an increasingly multipolar world. This instability has sharpened inter-imperialist rivalries, intensified militarization and war, but it has also opened new conditions ripe for resistance, solidarity, and revolutionary struggle. It is in this context that we gather today to hear reports and analysis from movements across the globe. Our speakers from the Asia Pacific, Canada, Latin America, and the Caribbean and Europe will help us understand how peoples are confronting the changing face of imperialism in their regions. And this conversation will continue when we hear from comrades in West Asia, Africa, and the United States this coming June. For now, I would like to call our very first speaker from the Philippines. He is currently with Bagong Alyansang Makabayan and is coordinating the International League of People Struggles in the Philippines. I would like to call on our comrade Arnold Padilla.
Good morning from Manila. The deepening crisis of monopoly capitalism has marked the past 25 years in the Asia-Pacific region. Such a deepening crisis has been characterized by the sharpening contradiction, as described by Sarah earlier, between the United States and China, the intensification of militarization and fascist repression, and at the same time, the resurgence of people's resistance and revolutionary struggle. Asia-Pacific has become both a center of inter-imperialist contradictions and a principal theater of anti-imperialist struggle. The fundamental backdrop to developments in the Asia-Pacific is the unresolved and worsening crisis of global monopoly capitalism. The world capitalist economy remains trapped in prolonged stagnation, overproduction, financial instability, worsening inequality, and ecological destruction. The monopoly bourgeoisie in the major capitalist powers has failed to resolve the crisis of overproduction despite decades of neoliberal restructuring, financialization, and militarization. Instead, the burden of the crisis has been shifted onto workers and oppressed nations through austerity, debt dependency, land and resource grabbing, neoliberal globalization, and wars of aggression. Professor Jose Maria Sison traced how the current contradiction between the US and China developed in the past 25 years. China's capitalist restoration transformed the country into a major site of imperialist accumulation, export-oriented manufacturing, and capitalist expansion. US imperialism integrated China into neoliberal globalization to expand markets, reduce production costs, and sustain profitability amid crisis. The US outsourced large-scale manufacturing to China while concentrating on finance, high technology, and military production. China, in turn, used state planning and state-owned enterprises to rapidly accumulate capital, acquire technology, and expand globally. For a period, the US and China collaborated closely within the framework of neoliberal globalization. The US viewed China as a profitable partner and a stabilizer for the world capitalist economy. China's accession to the World Trade Organization 25 years ago symbolized this integration. Yet, this cooperation contained within it the seeds of the current inter-imperialist contradiction between the US and China. China's rapid economic rise has gradually transformed it from a subordinate partner of US imperialism into a strategic rival. Over the last 25 years, US policy towards the Asia-Pacific has evolved from selective engagement with China to open strategic confrontation. During the Bush era after 9/11, counterterrorism temporarily displaced strategic rivalry, and Washington sought cooperation with Beijing while reinforcing military alliances across Asia. But under the Obama administration, the pivot to Asia, or the rebalance, openly signaled a shift toward containing China's rise through military redeployment, alliance building, and economic initiatives such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Under Trump, the contradiction sharpened dramatically into an open trade war, technology war, and geopolitical confrontation. China was explicitly labeled a revisionist power seeking to change the status quo, while the US launched tariff wars, semiconductor restrictions, sanctions, and intensified deployments in the Indo-Pacific. Under Biden and continuing into the second Trump administration, strategic competition has become institutionalized through the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad, the AUKUS, the Indo-Pacific military architecture of expanded bases, troop deployments, alliances, and technological networks, and aggressive naval operations in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. The Asia-Pacific region has therefore become the central arena of the contradiction between a declining hegemon, desperately trying to preserve its dominant position, and a rising imperialist power, both seeking markets, resources, investment fees, and strategic control and spheres of influence. This sharpening contradiction between the US and China is expressed most concretely in the Philippines, which has become one of the key frontline states in Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy. Especially under the current Marcos Jr. regime, the US has rapidly consolidated and expanded its military control over the country through a network of agreements, troop deployments, and strategic infrastructure projects. The 1951 Philippine-US Mutual Defense Treaty, or the MDT, which this year is now 75 years old, has been aggressively operationalized through the 1998 Visiting Forces Agreement, or the VFA, and the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or the EDCA, to transform the Philippines into a major platform in Asia-Pacific for US power projection against China. The MDT was further updated through the 2023 bilateral defense guidelines to make it more relevant in the context of China's rise and the assertion of US imperialism's hegemony. Additional EDCA sites, which are the present form of US military bases in the Philippines, have been opened, including in strategic locations facing Taiwan and the West Philippine Sea, allowing for expanded rotational presence of US troops, the prepositioning of weapons and fuel, the construction of military facilities, and enhanced intelligence and surveillance operations. The annual Balikatan War exercises have grown into some of the largest joint military drills in decades, involving not only combat simulations and missile systems, but also participation from allied powers such as Japan and Australia. These war exercises under Marcos Jr. are no longer routine training, but have become a platform for full-spectrum war preparation. For the first time in the history of US military exercises in the Philippines, for instance, the US fired a Tomahawk missile using its Typhoon missile system during a Balikatan war exercise just a couple of weeks ago, which traveled more than 600 kilometers within Philippine territory. Japan, US imperialism's longtime junior partner in the Asia-Pacific, also fired surface-to-ship missiles which traveled about 75 kilometers offshore from a northern Philippine province. The live firing of a US long-range missile from Philippine soil signals a new and more dangerous stage in the escalation of tension in the region. Under the guise of defense cooperation and regional security, US imperialism is effectively converting the entire Philippine archipelago into a forward operating base in preparation for possible confrontation with China. This militarization directly threatens Philippine sovereignty and drags the Filipino people deeper into the danger of inter-imperialist war and dangerously stokes war in the entire Asia-Pacific. US consolidation in the Philippines is also advancing through economic and technological mechanisms tied to its strategic competition with China. In recent years, the rivalry between two powers has increasingly centered on control over advanced technologies, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and critical mineral supply chains. Within this context, Washington increasingly views the Philippines as strategically important to its efforts to counter China and secure US dominance in emerging technologies. Projects such as the Luzon Economic Corridor, promoted together with Japan and other allies, aim to integrate key Philippine infrastructure, ports, railways, logistics systems, energy networks, and industrial zones into the broader US-led Indo-Pacific economic architecture. The Luzon Economic Corridor plays a significant role in the Pax Silica Global Alliance established by the US in December 2025 to secure global technology supply chains and achieve dominance in the era of artificial intelligence for both industrial and military purposes. Pax Silica represents a direct challenge by US imperialism to China's current dominance in both the upstream and downstream sectors of AI technology. At present, the alliance has 16 members, including 6 Asia-Pacific countries considered among Washington's closest allies, namely Australia, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, India, and of course, Philippines. The Pax Silica is now being aggressively rolled out within a so-called economic security zone in the Philippines Luzon Economic Corridor. The economic security zone is the first concrete on-the-ground project and flagship deployment under the Pax Silica initiative. The zone covers around 4,000 acres or more than 1,600 hectares of land that the US is seeking to treat as diplomatic property, on which it will enjoy immunity and extraterritorial rights. What it means is that the Philippines will cede sovereign control over its territory to the US, underscoring that the economic security zone is not merely an investment hub, but one of strategic security importance to US imperialism. The Philippines, of course, reportedly rejected the US request, but apparently, negotiations are still ongoing. But regardless, the fact remains that a massive size of Philippine lands will be used for US imperialism's war production, deepen foreign corporate control over strategic sectors of the Philippine economy, intensify the plunder of our natural resources, displace our communities, and further lock the country into a dependent and comprador economic structure. Remember that the 1,600 hectares of the economic security zone will only house the production and processing facilities. However, the raw materials, namely the critical minerals, will be sourced, will be mined from tens of thousands of hectares more throughout the Philippines. Earlier this year, the US signed a bilateral critical minerals deal with the Philippines to secure its technology supply chain. The US has signed such bilateral deals with 22 countries worldwide, 8 of which are in the Asia-Pacific region, including the Philippines. So therefore, both militarily and economically, the Philippines and the rest of the Asia-Pacific have become crucial nodes in the US campaign to preserve its global imperialist hegemony amid its escalating rivalry with China. China has emerged as a major imperialist power pursuing its own expansionist agenda. China's aggressive claims in the West Philippine Sea, militarization of artificial islands, economic penetration, debt diplomacy, and exploitation of resources represent concrete forms of imperialist encroachment. Its Belt and Road Initiative, while presented as development cooperation, often reinforces bureaucrat capitalism, including massive corruption, debt burdens, and strategic leverage over weaker countries. The peoples of the Asia-Pacific therefore confront the dual danger of continued US hegemony and rising Chinese imperialism. The contradiction between these two powers intensifies militarization throughout the region. The South China Sea has become a major flashpoint. Taiwan remains a potential trigger for war. Military spending across Asia-Pacific has surged, while fascist and authoritarian tendencies grow under the pretext of national security. The danger is that the Philippines and the broader Asia-Pacific region may become battlegrounds for a direct or proxy conflict between rival imperialist powers. As Professor Sison warned, countries and peoples in the Asia-Pacific are in the direct line of fire should armed conflict between the US and China erupt. The region is increasingly saturated with military exercises, missile systems, naval patrols, intelligence operations, and strategic encirclement. In the Philippines, successive regimes have exploited the US-China contradiction for their own comprador interests while sacrificing national sovereignty. Duterte, who is now in ICC, our previous president, maneuvered between Washington and Beijing while deepening ties with both. The current regime under Marcos Jr., meanwhile, has aligned more openly with the US, granting expanded access to military bases through the EDCA and supporting US strategic positioning against China. The ILPS Philippines rejects both the pro-US and pro-China camps within sections of the Philippine ruling elite and calls for an independent foreign policy. The growth of authoritarianism across the Asia-Pacific reflects the intensifying contradictions and deepening crisis of imperialism. Fascist and proto-fascist regimes have emerged in India, in the Philippines, and in other countries where ruling classes increasingly rely on repression to contain mass discontent. Anti-terror laws, surveillance systems, red tagging, militarization, and attack on democratic rights have proliferated. At the same time, we recognize that inter-imperialist contradictions create not just dangers, but also opportunities for the peoples. Historically, rivalries among imperialists have weakened the global system of domination and created openings for anti-imperialist struggles, national liberation movements, and socialist forces. The past 25 years have witnessed growing resistance in all its forms throughout the Asia Pacific and the world. Workers, peasants, indigenous peoples, youth, women, migrants, and oppressed nations have launched struggles against neoliberalism, fascism, environmental destruction, militarization, and imperialist domination. Mass uprisings erupted in Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Myanmar, South Korea, and the Philippines. General strikes, peasant mobilizations, anti-war protests, and anti-fascist movements have spread throughout the region. Armed resistance against US-backed reactionary rule and for national liberation persists despite severe repression. Solidarity protests and movements continue to expand, including mobilization against the US-Israeli war of aggression, against Iran and the Zionist genocide in Gaza, backed by UN imperialism. We must note how the Palestine Solidarity Movement has become one of the defining anti-imperialist mobilizations of recent years. Millions across Asia Pacific announced the US-backed Zionist genocide. This movement demonstrates the growing internationalization of people's struggles. Professor Season characterized our period today as a transition toward the resurgence of the world proletarian revolution. Despite the defeat of capitalist restoration in China and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fundamental contradictions of capitalism have intensified. The neoliberal order failed to deliver stability and prosperity. Instead, it produced greater inequality, ecological catastrophe, fascism, and endless war. As Professor Season said, the strategic task today is to build the broadest anti-imperialist united front while maintaining proletarian leadership and revolutionary orientation. The peoples of the Asia Pacific must reject alignment with either US or Chinese imperialism. The struggle is not to choose between rival empires, but to fight for genuine national liberation, democracy, social justice, and socialism. For the ILPS Philippines, the essential perspective is clear. Imperialism remains the fundamental of the peoples. US imperialism continues to be the principal aggressor globally, while Chinese imperialism emerges as a rising rival seeking its own sphere of dominance. The sharpening contradiction between them heightens the risk of war and fascism, including in our region. Yet these same contradictions also create conditions conducive to strengthening a broad global movement against imperialism. Asia Pacific as the primary front in this historic period of intensifying inter-imperialist contradictions, the region will be a decisive battleground in the global people's struggle against imperialism. Asia Pacific contains both rapidly expanding imperialist ambitions and at the same time some of the world's most militant people's movements. The future, our future, will depend not on the maneuvers of rival powers alone, but on the capacity of the oppressed and exploited peoples to organize independently and wage sustained struggle. This requires strengthening our multi-sectoral struggles against neoliberal exploitation, for land, genuine agrarian reform and rural development, for the defense of ancestral lands and territories, against plunder and climate destruction, and against militarization, fascism, and imperialist war. It requires international solidarity, among people resisting imperialism in all forms. Today, one of the most urgent challenges is to aggressively build, strengthen, and expand our global movement and struggle against imperialist war and plunder, and for just and lasting peace. We must tirelessly and patiently educate the broadest section of the people that imperialism means war and preparations for war, as Lenin famously declared. And therefore, the struggle against war and the quest for just and lasting peace are inseparable from the anti-imperialist struggle. Only through unwavering education can we transform the growing spontaneous resistance against imperialist war and plunder into an organized and anti-imperialist movement and revolutionary struggle capable of advancing toward genuine liberation and achieving our socialist future. Good morning and thank you.
Thank you very much to Comrade Arnold Padilla from Bayan and ILPS Philippines, representing the Asia Pacific region, the primary front of the International League of People Struggles. Comrade Arnold, we especially appreciate your emphasis on the foundational analysis provided by Comrade Jose Maria Sison, beloved comrade, founding chairperson, and later chair emeritus of the ILPS. His legacy of proletarian internationalism continues to resonate clearly in the analytical interventions of younger comrades like Comrade Arnold, carried forward not only in theory, but through concrete mobilizations and struggles in the Philippines and across the broader Asian region. We honor Comrade Season's legacy through committed theoretical study, side by side with on-the-ground organizing, affirming the unity of theory and practice as indispensable to building a broader and intensified struggle against imperialism and all reaction. So from the Philippines, the Asia Pacific region, the primary front, we move on to the Trump corollary. We will have two speakers. Let's first hear from our comrade from Latin America. Hold on a second. We would like to call on from Unidad Civica, Felipe Carrillo Puerto, and he's also a member of the ILPS ICC from Mexico. We would like to call on Comrade Pablo.
So nothing that is useful to society is possible without workers. Felipe Carrillo Puerto, Mexican indigenous socialist leaders, nothing can stand against this avalanche of love. Nothing can stand against this avalanche of life. Nothing can stand against the people's faith in the sheer power of their hands. And nothing can stand against life because nothing has ever been able to stand against life. Guatemalan poet Otto René Castillo from Guatemala. Fraternal greetings, comrades from Querétaro, Mexico. Dear comrades, sisters, and brothers of our glorious International League of the Struggles of the People, I am honored to extend my greetings and embrace on behalf of our chapters across our beautiful, vast, and oppressed Latin America. From the Organization of Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Colombia, Argentina, and Bolivia, to send you our essential analysis of the situation on our continents. From Rio Grande to Patagonia. We honor our comrade Sergio Abad by his name of struggle and battle, Pascal Duarte, who departed this world on the past August 8th, 2020, 5. He used to be our vice president for Latin America and the Caribbean, and we keep him present in our struggle for liberation and the independent and the necessity of a socialist future. In the history of our anti-imperialist movement over these 25 years, a quarter century, we in Latin America have resisted and raised the voice of rebellion against the imposition of neoliberalism by the capitalist system, and now with even greater force in the face of a new Yankee neocolonialist imperialist slaughter led by the ultra-fascist, racist, supremacist, and pro-genocidal Donald Trump against our territories and peoples. We are peoples forged in the resistance against oppression, against oppressive kingdom, monarchies that invaded us. We defended our Mother Earth as the center of collective life, their worldview of indigenous people, their culture, with brave armies that defended her, and their languages of poetry. We were victims of colonial war that not only invaded, stripped, plundered territories, chaining us for centuries, but also they committed one of the most atrocious holocausts and genocide in the history of humanity. Tens of millions of our sisters and brothers were murdered during these cruel periods. Our people rose up to break the chains, breaking the chains of the absolutist monarchies of Europe. Since then, the dominance of the United States emerged in the early stages of its formation as a capitalist state. With the rise of industrial revolution, the new political, economic, and military empire of the United States through the Monroe Doctrine of the fifth president, James Monroe, with his doctrine, opening quote, America for the American, end quote. The Yankees have applied it as America for the United States. Our country, our homeland, multi-ethnic and multicultural nation of Mexico, was the first to suffer this new process of domination with the false independence of Texas in 1836, when the U.S. residents acting as traders separated the state from Mexico and annexed it to the United States. In 1946 to 48, they declared war, which ended thanks to the trader like Antonio Lopez de Santana, with 55% of our original territory given away. The peoples of Central America, the Caribbean, and South America were declared exclusive zone of influence of the US. In the 20th century, the US began with the imposing of its bully policy, the first manifestation of which was the separation of Panama from the Republic of Colombia and the promotion of the Panama Canal. The 20th century was characterized by the territorial imposition of the interests of multinationals like the United Fruit Company, the Banana Wars, and the invasion of fights against our brother people of Nicaragua with Sandino's successful resistance. That was an example. That's how they created that specter of communism. Supposedly democratic government were aligned in the face of a revolution in our country. It promoted the execution of most of the revolutionary leaders. Emiliano Zapata, Ricardo Flores Magón, Francisco Villa, the only military leader to carry out a successful military incursion. Columbus in 1916 and Felipe Carrillo Puerto. It was the beginning of the horrors of a dictatorship. The Salvadorian and Nicaraguan people suffered under the imposition of bloodthirsty fascist regimes like Maximiliano Garcia, who committed a massacre in 1932, in which more than 30,000 peasants were executed. The dynasty initiated by Somoza as a reward of the assassination of Sandino was the result of it. This model persisted during the whole century The CIA orchestrated coup against democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, Juan Domingo Perón in Argentina, Juan Bosch in Dominican Republic, Allende in Chile, a socialist leader who was brutally assassinated. That's just a synthesis of what we went through. Cuba and Nicaragua achieved processes of second economic independence with socialist revolutions. Our international league, founded in 2001, emerged in the midst of anti-neoliberal resistance against the lies of the free market and the global economy that was supposed to give prosperity to humanity. Lies that fell apart quite soon, with the same aim of intensifying the plunder and dispossession of indigenous territories to take control over their rich lands and territories, waters and forests. Their objective was to impose the other exploitation of the peoples, women and men, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. They created a new devil, the drug traffickers. But the US are the promoters of drug trafficking. It's part of their new strategy of war. The ILPS chapters are located in very intense struggle context. The neoliberal program has been largely defeated through popular social mobilization and electoral process. We've led at the emergence of fundamentally social democrats government that are not looking for socialist revolutions. There's a strong resistance from organizations and movements with a strong socialist communist identity. But self-critically, we recognize that we're dispersed, that we're far from being a political alternative that builds toward the inevitable future of humanity, which is socialism. We are in the midst of a structural crisis of the capitalist system, facing an economic slowdown of the extensions of wealth, financial speculation that do not produce goods or services, the exploitation of working class. The US is in decline, but it's a moment that is really dangerous, not just for socialist revolutionary, but for all humanity and the planet. They provoke the polarization and reorganization of the most reactionary forces who are resurging with their classism, fascism, racism, and supremacism, in which they now openly seek the overexploitation of peoples and of territories and natural resources, not only through economic policies, but also through military means to invade, destabilize, and even commit genocide and use their deadly nuclear arsenal, like the one against the Palestinian people. It is essential to strengthen the resistance struggle in Latin America, and even more, so our International League of People's struggle can be stronger. We are making a great effort, but self-critically, we are moving slowly. We are in the continent where this empire, whose domination has been the most atrocious for humanity, it is very important for the leadership of the chapters to promote the strategic strengthening of ILPS. Greetings from where we defend territories, fundamental rights, for the rights of housing, education, defense of the liberties. We look for our disappeared. We want justice for our fallen, and we demand freedom for our political prisoners. Freedom for our political prisoners. Alejandro Ochoa and Francisco Azarte in Mexico, in Querétaro, Mexico. The revolution is not carried in the mouth to live off it, but in the heart. to die for it. Ernesto Che Guevara, long live the 25 years of the ILPS.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Comrade Pablo. That was really a very inspiring and moving presentation of colonialism, plunder, imperialism, but most of all, the valiant resistance of the peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean. We move on to what anti-imperialists call the second-rate imperialists trying to become first. These are the imperialist partner of U.S. imperialism. But we are proud to say that ILPS has managed to actually build people's struggle in the United Kingdom. And for today, we have our comrade, Comrade Norwin, representing ILPS Britain and Anakbayan UK. Comrade Norwin, the floor is yours.
Hello. With regards to Europe, the past 25 years has shown an intensification of imperialist crisis. Each country is beset with inflation of the prices of basic goods, slow economic growth, stagnant wages, cuts towards social welfare programs, and a rising wave of xenophobia and far-right politics that locates the cause of these problems on migrant workers and refugees. The European Union and Britain are seeking to dramatically increase military spending. Rearm Europe, for instance, aims to invest 800 billion euros into Europe's defense infrastructure, while Britain is planning to do similarly and increase defense spending to 3% of its GDP. With the heightening of imperialist rivalries today, Europe is seeking greater strategic autonomy while at the same time continuing to ally with US imperialism against the threats from China and Russia. For the most part, Europe has marched step by step aligned with US imperialism following the Second World War. Post-war European states were integrated within the US-led imperialist bloc against the socialist bloc led by the Soviet Union and People's Republic of China. This post-war integration can be seen with the adoption of the Marshall Plan, superficially aid given by the US to jumpstart recovery after the war, but in actuality, an exercise of exporting US capital to reconstruct post-war European economies under terms favorable to the expansion of US commercial interests. Politically and militarily, the countries of Europe allied with the US as members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949, uniting the old imperialists of Europe under US military leadership to contain and oppose socialism and the Soviet Union. The turn of the century saw European participation in supporting US acts of aggression for imperialist plunder. While the Soviet Union had collapsed in the 1990s and there was capitalist restoration in many former members of the socialist bloc, NATO continued to exist primarily as a vehicle for the projection of US power globally. European NATO members were involved both in the occupation of Afghanistan as part of NATO's International Security Assistance Force and the 2011 intervention in Libya. In the meanwhile, Europe further consolidated economically within the European Union with the adoption of the Eurozone in 1999. The global financial crisis in 2008 resulted in widespread loss of jobs, unemployment, and was ruinous for the working class of both Europe and the United States, in addition to the toiling masses of the global South, but also included further integration of the monopoly capitalists of both Europe and the US. Right now, the EU and US economies are each other's most significant trade and investment partners. Total US investment in the EU is 4 times larger than its investment in the Asia Pacific, while EU investments in the US are 10 times larger than in India and China put together. But it would be too easy to suggest that Europe is all too willing to remain in a subordinate position to US imperialist policy. Especially following Brexit, where the British people in a slim majority voted to leave the EU, and subsequent Trump administrations, there is an observable aim of Europe to develop strategic autonomy from the United States as the latter attempts to safeguard its position as the global hegemon of the imperialist world system. There have been US tariffs placed upon European aluminium and steel products, which prompted EU retaliation with their own tariffs. There have also been unilateral US withdrawals from multilateral agreements, such as the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris Agreement on climate change, in addition to withdrawals of US troops from Germany and Afghanistan without consultation with European allies. For some of the more backwards and reactionary components of the American ruling class, Europe is not paying its fair share via American commitments to the region, while European policymakers are losing faith in supposed American guarantees to their security and well-being. For the moment, Europe remains dependent on the US as an energy exporter and for the provision of its military needs. For instance, 60% of weapon sales to European NATO members are from American defense companies. This dependence motivates the aggressive pursuing from the EU for new free trade deals, especially in critical minerals that can be used for their supposed green transition. The contradictions between US and European imperialists are another sign of the intensification of the inter-imperialist rivalry, in addition with the decline of US hegemony. The US can no longer guarantee the protection of European investments and profits, requiring European imperialists to develop more robust protections independent of the United States. This is to the ruin of genuine peace and democracy, as both are united in ramping up militarization and arms spending. It is more clear than ever of the need for people's movements in Europe to unite and resist imperialism. And over the last 25 years, there has been vigorous resistance. Following the demise of the Soviet Union, there was an influx of different international formations from non-governmental organizations, religious institutions, private donors, and UN agencies that attempted to guide the struggles of the masses towards more reformist goals and aims. These institutions ultimately served the interests of imperialism because they could not challenge nor address the principal conditions of society that was pillaging the toiling masses in both imperialist and global South countries. As the sole global hegemon, the United States, supported by its European allies, embarked on a mission to overturn any government that was resisting US dictates. It launched the most brutal wars of imperialist aggression on Iraq and Afghanistan during the early 2000s. Yet this repression generated resistance as people's movements across the world asserted their democratic rights to oppose these wars. The Iraq War in particular generated the largest civilian protests in Europe. 1 to 2 million people in Britain marched in their largest ever demonstration, while 3 million took to the streets in Rome in what still remains the largest anti-war rally in history. And it was during this time where the International League of People's Struggle was first established in Europe as a response to the flagrant abuses of people's rights by the United States. It's clear that ILPS was born out of the ever-worsening crisis of monopoly capitalism. In 2001, over 200 organizations from 38 countries convened the first General Assembly of the ILPS and marked a crucial distinction between other reformist multilateral institutions, they did not reach the political unity of anti-imperialism. The League itself was backed by national liberation movements in countries like the Philippines, Palestine, Turkey, India, among many others, and served as an important place for anti-imperialists from different struggles to unite and communicate with each other in a broad anti-imperialist united front. European countries responded to the financial crisis of 2008 with various degrees of austerity measures aiming to cut public spending on health, education, and other means of societal support. In comparison to the US, Europe is distinct for using a portion of the surplus value gained from imperialist exploitation and appropriation of super profits from the oppressed peoples of the colonies and semi-colonies for some social welfare programs. These programs have been attacked and cut in favor of the monopoly capitalists in Europe. These neoliberal attacks have reduced wide sections of the working class into low-paid, precariously employed, or outright unemployment as they compete among themselves for reduced social benefits. Again, these cuts were not taken lying down. Throughout Europe, there were massive protests against the imposition of austerity measures along with more direct action. The most dramatic rejection of this situation may be Brexit, where the strongest Brexit strongholds were the UK's industrial areas that had been the worst hit by the financial crisis and the long history of neoliberalism and outsourcing from Thatcher. As the crisis born from imperialism continues to ravage the working class of Europe, there has been a notable increase in the influence of right-wing nationalists and xenophobes who campaign to spread hatred and anger against refugees and immigrants, particularly after the wave of refugees fleeing to the EU from West Asia. These ultra-nationalist sentiments are generated and propped up by sections of the monopoly capitalists to obscure the capitalist roots of the crisis and inflame the backward sections of the working class against refugees and migrant workers. While there have been some responses, ultimately the political left in Europe as it exists currently has been so far unable to halt the spread of these narratives. Both the United States and Europe have been mainly responsible for the refugee crisis due to their continued participation in imperialist wars of aggression since the Iraq War. Despite the crisis, proletarian parties within European countries have been unable to effectively mobilize the masses to form a bulwark against reaction. And the rise of far-right parties in Italy, France, Germany, and Britain are a testament to this weakness. But there is hope. There has been a resurgence in anti-imperialist organizing following Operation Al-Aqsa flood in October 7, 2023, where the Palestinian resistance broke through the prison doors of the Zionist blockade of Gaza. The people of the world have been moved to action by the open recourse of the US Zionist state of genocide and mass destruction of the Palestinian people and their land. Millions have taken to the streets in frequent solidarity marches for Palestine. Occupations by students of university property started in the US and then spread to Europe. There have been popular calls to boycott companies enmeshed with the Zionist entity. And the most dramatic actions of the past few years in Europe has been the general strike in Italy, called by workers disgusted by the complicity of Italy in the US Zionist-led genocide and the attacks on the Global Summit flotilla, as well as the direct action of activists to damage the offices of defense companies like Israeli-owned Elbit Systems, which have been most complicit in the production of arms that have martyred many of the Palestinian people. States like Britain have imprisoned these activists, prescribed their organizations as terrorists, and aims to further repress the Palestinian solidarity movement along with other anti-imperialist movements. This only serves to show the interests that are ultimately protected by the monopoly capitalists of Europe. They are fundamentally anti-people, anti-democratic, and will resort to violence whenever struggles and movements have strengthened to provide a vigorous attack to their foundations. Europe is a special region. It's the birthplace of both capitalism and socialism. It's a region riven with many contradictions. It's also the home to many different diasporas, part of the international reserve army of labor that monopoly capital in Europe extracts super profits from, migrating from semi-colonies to imperialist heartlands to work and eke out a living as an underclass of foreign workers. The task for democratic and progressive forces is to attack and challenge the right-wing rhetoric that locates the cause of imperialist crisis on migrant workers, because it is migrant labor, along with the labor of host country peoples, which produce the social product that is ripped away from the worker by monopoly capitalists. And it's for this reason why ILPS here in Europe and also in Britain has been involved in campaigns advocating and supporting migrant rights up to the level of national liberation of the home countries of these migrants, as well as supporting various different resist campaigns, which aims to provide a genuine peace campaign that supports the right of people to resist imperialist aggression. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Comrade Norwin. Thank you so much, Comrade Norwin, especially for emphasizing that ILPS was born in a time of imperialist war amid the invasion of Iraq. And this is such a stark reminder that imperialism means war. And if war is to end, an alternative must be built. And this alternative lies in strengthening national liberation struggles in the semi-colonies and the colonies, but also in core imperialist nations, as we build the foundations of a broad anti-imperialist united front, as we support Palestinian freedom and migrant rights. A truly meaningful anti-war movement must be anti-imperialist, for war is not accidental, but rooted in the systems of domination, exploitation, and monopoly power. So we really appreciate comrades from the imperialist core to be able to provide us this very important analysis. So comrades, as before we proceed, I must correct an omission from our earlier segment on the Trump corollary. A comrade had been patiently waiting to be introduced, and I should have called on him earlier. He's a comrade currently engaged in an important struggle in the land of Bolivar in Bolivia. Lo siento mucho, my sincere apologies. But it is now my honor to introduce Comrade Bayo, Secretary General of ILPS Bolivia, joining us from a country with a profound history of anti-imperialist struggle and people's resistance. Comrade Bayo, we are very excited to hear from you.
¿Ahora sí me escuchan? Muy bien. Les decía.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It is an honor for the ILPS Bolivia chapter to be part of this international webinar for the 25th anniversary of the League. From here in Bolivia, we find ourselves in a process of political change, a movement against the rightist government, and the embassy, the U.S. embassy, we wanted to take this opportunity to share a little bit about the experience of the anti-imperialist struggle in our country. And we believe that it's important that in this moment, within the 25 years anniversary, to share a summary of imperialism in Latin America. Hegemony refers not only to a country's economic and military power, but above all, its capacity for political influence and the legitimization of its own relations of dominance over the other countries. Clearly, by the end of the 20th century, the hegemony of US imperialism began to crumble, not because it lacked power, but because its political and economic agenda had lost its legitimacy. For the people in Latin America, this loss of hegemony by US imperialism has been linked to the ideological overcoming of neoliberalism by the struggle of the Latin American peoples, social movements, and the Latin American left, often referred to as progressives, supposedly, capitalize on this political rise, which greatly weakened imperialist hegemony. However, despite this retreat of imperialism, progressivism has not been able to dismantle the decaying relations of domination and oppression to build new social relations within the established international order. It has not been able to unite around a clear strategic goal, socialism. The failure to address the struggle for socialism in its structural and superstructural dimensions, and the limitations in understanding it, have led to the reformist functionalization of emerging political projects. Transformation processes were diluted amid bureaucratic maneuvers, prioritizing the macroeconomic stability of their economies over transforming people's lives. Popular struggle and mobilization gradually gave way to the democratizing illusions of bourgeois parliamentarism. Structural transformations lost ground to the heavy machinery of institutional bureaucracy. Legitimacy came to be valued less than legality, and ultimately, symbols, forms, and labels were changed rather than the substance and essence of political and economic power that determined the society's power relations. Therein lies the necessary self-criticism of the 21st century Latin America progressivism, which explains the reason for such sudden downfalls and setbacks in the face of imperialism onslaught. The reason for failing to establish a single effective agenda for anti-imperialist struggle, and finally, the reason why we have fallen victim to our own limitations. But at the same time, this self-criticism allows us to clearly identify imperialist tactics and strategies. Imperialism has turned to using its own institutions to rebuild its hegemony. That is, international law, global governance bodies, the international economy, representative democracy, and the institutions that underpin the effective power of states, such as armed forces, the police, the media, political manipulation through digital social media platforms, and judicial systems, of course. In other words, imperialism is desperately trying to rebuild its lost hegemony. And to do so, it has always had at its disposal both violent and supposed democratic means. However, the tactics it is implementing today to decapitate processes of social transformation have not been open wars, but rather new generation wars. And political reformism has facilitated many of these processes of change, falling into the trap of, quote, lawfare, promoted by US imperialism in Latin America. However, this sort of judicial coup is not enough for it, because it is based on the construction of a false legitimacy of an artificial leadership or political hegemony, as it is built upon communicational narratives, post-truths, and legal and judicial reinterpretations of judicial bodies, instrumentalized for destabilization. This regional onslaught of imperialism in Latin America has created superficial political processes that do not represent the national minorities of oppressed peoples. In most cases, it has imposed right-wing governments through censorship, destabilization, soft coups, and proscriptions, whose political approach and source of legitimacy remains the old and familiar neoliberal project, privatizations, and the surrender of sovereignty and natural resources to transnational capital. This loss of the old hegemony of unipolar imperialism and the process of reconfiguring new hegemonic structures are indeed transitions or interregnums, but they are not indeterminate abstractions. They are much more complex correlations of forces that remain concrete. In other words, it is imperialism in the flesh and bones that resists ceding its geopolitical power base, and in the face of this, to sustain these new far-right regimes in Latin America, needs imperialism. It needs to resort to fascism, warmongering, trade war tactics, as it's been doing with Venezuela, Cuba, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, and Bolivia. On the other hand, the Latin American movement is undergoing a process of political reorganization, which necessarily draw on the lessons of experience, will have to revive programs of struggle aimed at proposing the structural transformation of capitalism to advance towards new civilizational horizons, through which it can definitely overcome decadent capitalism. It will have to rethink the nature of political instruments and the debate regarding the revolutionary parties needed to seize political power. We will have to remember once again that justice and the state have class content. They are non-institutions alien to the power of capital. And we will have to once again overcome parliamentary democratic illusions to stop considering partisan and undemocratic elections as the only effective spaces for the recovery of political and economic power. But fundamentally, we have to correct the limited national conception of our struggles, which is very pronounced in 21st century socialism in Latin America. From the left, we must return without prejudice to the understanding that national struggles cannot be victorious unless we consider them part of the fundamental and greater struggle against global capitalism and imperialism. In other words, we must once again embrace internationalism, not in words, but in action and organization. This means turning the construction of a democratic and binding international space that coordinates and unifies all revolutionary and anti-imperialist struggles, and above all, is capable of building a new agenda of anti-imperialist struggles for our time. What is unknown about the interregnum is which of the competing poles will prevail on this 25th anniversary. What is unknown about the interregnum is which of the competing poles will prevail. But we do know that either reactionary imperialism, which fiercely resists disappearing and threatens to drag all of humanity into barbarism, will prevail, or the socialist victory of the struggle of the free and sovereign people of the world will prevail. Thank you very much, comrades.
Thank you so much, Comrade Mayo, for your magnificent rendering of an approach to strengthening our anti-imperialist struggle. Comrade Bayo has shown us that only through historical and dialectical analysis can we push the struggle further towards genuine internationalism. And it requires our ability to recognize weaknesses, contradictions, and understand their development and act upon the concrete conditions of our struggle. Thank you so much. That was Comrade Bayo from Bolivia. Comrades, as we conclude, we want to be able to give justice to the great presentations given by our friends and comrades from the different regions of ILPS. And what has become unmistakably clear from our speakers today is the truly moribund and parasitic state of imperialism. And in its crisis, imperialism no longer offers development, stability, or peace. It offers only intensified exploitation, militarization, dispossession, and war. US imperialism in particular, as our speakers have explained, seeks to preserve its dominance through military aggression, economic coercion, and political intervention, even as its hegemony faces deep contradictions and growing resistance. And yet, what stands out just as clearly is this: the peoples of the world continue to fight back. From the Philippines and across Asia, we see peoples resisting military occupation, neoliberal devastation, and proxy wars waged in the name of security and development. In Latin America, we are reminded of the long history of US-backed coups, intervention, and the plunder carried out by multinational corporations, from the violence of companies like United Fruit to enduring lies of the so-called free market. Yet, despite repression, the resistance of workers, peasants, women, indigenous peoples, national minorities, and youth continues to grow. And even across the global north, including among imperialist partners like the United Kingdom and other Western powers, we witness the same logic of exploitation of peoples at home and abroad, and as well by organized resistance, anti-war movements, labor struggles, and international solidarity. So the fight against imperialism continues because conditions that produce exploitation and oppression remain. But so too does the determination of the people to struggle and win. On our 25th year, we honor Comrade Jose Maria Sison and take to heart his urgent call that any genuine global anti-war and anti-fascist movement can only be anti-imperialist if it seeks to confront the roots of war radically and not merely its symptoms. And as we close our program for today, we encourage everyone to look out for future ILPS at 25 webinars and events, including part 2 of this series, where we will deepen our discussion on the effects and development of imperialism and the struggle against it in West Asia, in Africa, and yes, even the number one terrorist force in the whole wide world today, the United States. And now, as we continue in remembrance and struggle, we transition to the Crispin Beltran, Cabell Memorial Assembly. Cabell is a beloved proletarian hero in the Philippines who brought the struggles of the Filipino working poor to the attention and embrace of comrades worldwide through his active engagement of the ILPS, of the International League of People's Struggle. The League, on its 25th year, honors his legacy as we continue our struggle. La lucha sigue. Thank you very much for being with us on this webinar.